My parents demanded I deed my house to my brother or they'd ruin me. My lawyer just laughed, and I broke free. The karma that followed stunned the family and left them with nothing. I am Claire. I am 34 years old, and I was sitting in a leather chair that cost more than my first car, listening to my parents threaten to destroy my life. The heavy mahogany desk belonged to my lawyer, Valerie Thorne. Valerie sat across from me, her manicured fingers steepled together, her face an unreadable mask of absolute calm. Between us, sitting on top of a stack of legal pads, was my cell phone on speaker mode. The voices crackling through the tiny audio output filled the quiet office with a toxic familiarity I had known my entire life. You are going to sign the deed over to Derek by Friday, Claire. Do you hear me? My father, Harrison, barked the words. There was no request in his tone, only the heavy, blunt force of a command he expected to be obeyed immediately. Your brother is getting married. He needs that house to start his family. You are a single woman. You don't need all that space. It is incredibly selfish of you to hoard family resources when Derek is struggling. Before I could even take a breath to respond, my mother, Diana, chimed in. Her voice was pitched in that familiar, whining register she always used when she wanted to play the victim while holding a knife to your throat. Claire, honey, please don't make this ugly. We raised you. We put a roof over your head. You owe us this. If you don't go down to the county clerk and transfer that property to your brother, your father and I will have no choice but to take legal action. We will sue you. We will claim you made a verbal agreement to hold the house for him. We will drag your name through the mud with every single aunt, uncle, and cousin in this family. We will ruin you financially with legal fees until you have to sell it anyway. Do not test us. I stared at the phone. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, my palms sweaty against the fabric of my jeans. The little girl inside me, the one who had spent her whole life terrified of their anger, wanted to curl up into a ball and surrender. I had spent 34 years being conditioned to fold the second they raised their voices. But then I looked at Valerie. Valerie slowly reached forward and pressed the mute button on my phone. The red light blinked on. Then, she leaned back in her chair and did something I completely did not expect. She laughed. It was a soft, low, incredibly dark chuckle. It was the sound of a predator watching a very stupid prey walk directly into a trap. Are they always this theatrical? Valerie asked, her voice smooth as silk over steel. Usually, I whispered, my throat dry. They mean it, Valerie. They will try to ruin me. Valerie smiled, and it was a terrifyingly beautiful thing. Claire, they are threatening to sue you for a property that is solely in your name, purchased with your own money, with zero paper trail connecting them to it. Let them try. But before we get to the fun part, I need to know exactly how deep this delusion goes. Tell me about the dynamic. Tell me why they think they can just take your home and hand it to your brother. I took a deep, shaky breath, unmuted the phone, firmly said, I will see you in court, Harrison, and hung up. Then I looked at Valerie and began to explain the nightmare of growing up in the shadow of the golden boy. If Derek was the sun in my parents' universe, I was just empty space. I was the ghost that haunted the hallways of my own childhood home. Derek is 36 now, 2 years older than me, but emotionally, he never really aged past a spoiled teenager. Growing up, the rules were fundamentally different for us. If I brought home an A- on a report card, my father would lecture me for an hour about how I wasn't applying myself and how I was going to end up a failure. If Derek brought home a D, my mother would blame the teacher, the school system, or the lighting in his classroom. Nothing was ever Derek's fault. Everything was always my fault. I learned very early on that to survive in that house, I had to become completely invisible and hyper-independent. I learned to do my own laundry by the time I was 8. I packed my own lunches. I forged my parents' signatures on permission slips because asking them to read a piece of paper was treated like an unforgivable burden. Derek, meanwhile, was bailed out of every mistake he ever made. When he wrecked his first car because he was speeding, my parents bought him a nicer, newer one 2 weeks later, saying he had suffered enough trauma from the accident. When he dropped out of his first college, They paid for a second one. When he dropped out of that one, they let him live rent-free in their basement while he found his passion, which mostly consisted of playing video games and eating expensive takeout that my mother paid for. The defining moment of our dynamic happened on my 16th birthday. I had been saving up money from babysitting for 6 months to go to a concert with 2 friends. It was the only thing I had asked for. The morning of my birthday, Derek, who was 18 at the time, sprained his ankle at lacrosse practice. It wasn't broken. It was a mild sprain. My mother walked into my room, took the car keys, and told me my birthday was canceled. When I cried and begged, explaining I had paid for the tickets myself, she looked at me with genuine disgust. "Your brother is in pain, Claire. He might lose his sports scholarship. And all you care about is some stupid loud music? Stop being so incredibly selfish. You need to stay home and help me bring him ice packs." I didn't go to the concert. I spent my 16th birthday fetching ice for a brother who smirked at me every time our parents turned their backs. That was the day I stopped asking them for anything. I realized that any love or support from them would always come with a price tag I couldn't afford, and it would always be revoked the second Derek needed attention. I locked my emotions away in a tight box. I worked multiple jobs through state college. I moved out the exact day I graduated, renting a terrible, cramped apartment with 3 roommates just to be free of them. I thought distance would protect me. I didn't realize that their entitlement to my life had no boundaries. 5 years ago, when I was 29, I made a decision that changed the trajectory of my life. I had been working 80-hour weeks at a logistics firm, eating cheap instant noodles, never going out, saving every single penny I could. I had managed to scrape together enough for a down payment on a house. But I couldn't afford anything nice. The only thing in my budget was a completely wrecked, abandoned 1920s craftsman house on the wrong side of town. It cost $140,000. Everyone told me I was insane. The roof was sagging. The plumbing was a disaster. It smelled like wet dust, mold, and decades of neglect. When I proudly sent a picture of the keys to the family group chat, hoping for just an ounce of congratulations, my mother replied with a text that read, "Why on earth would you buy a rotten coffin? You are going to die alone in that money pit. Your father offered to help you find a nice, safe apartment complex, but you always have to be difficult." They didn't offer a dime. They didn't offer a day of physical labor. They just offered judgment. But I didn't care. That rotten coffin was mine. For the next 5 years, that house became my entire world. It was my therapy, my gym, and my obsession. Because I couldn't afford contractors, I became one. I spent my weekends watching YouTube tutorials on how to hang drywall. I learned how to solder copper pipes. I rented heavy machinery to pull up dead bushes in the yard. I remember one specific week in January during my first year there. The heating system completely failed. It was freezing outside. I was sleeping on a mattress on the bare subfloor, wrapped in 3 sleeping bags, wearing a winter coat indoors. I was eating canned soup heated up on a cheap camping stove. My hands were covered in blisters and cuts from ripping out old, rotting floorboards. I was exhausted to my very bones. And yet, lying there in the freezing dark, listening to the wind rattle the old window panes, I felt a profound sense of peace. Nobody could yell at me here. Nobody could tell me I was a disappointment. If a pipe burst, it was my problem to fix, but it was also my victory when I stopped the leak. I poured my literal blood, sweat, and tears into the foundation of that house. Slowly, painfully, it transformed. I sanded the original hardwood floors until they glowed. I painted the walls warm, inviting colors. I planted a garden out back. The house healed me as much as I healed it. It stood as physical proof that I was capable, that I had value, and that I could build something beautiful from the dirt up. I didn't know it then, but making that house beautiful was the exact thing that would put a target on my back. The funny thing about real estate is that things can change overnight. About 3 years into my renovations, the city announced a massive revitalization project for my neighborhood. Suddenly, the wrong side of town became the trendy historical district. Artisanal coffee shops and boutique bakeries started popping up on the corner. My $140,000 money pit? The last appraisal I got for insurance purposes put the value right around $500,000. I had created massive equity with my own two hands. It was amazing how quickly my family's attitude shifted once the neighborhood became desirable. Suddenly, my parents, who had refused to visit me for years because the area was too dangerous, started dropping by unannounced. They would walk through my living room, running their hands over the restored brick fireplace, making little comments under their breath. The real trouble started when Derek met Morgan. Morgan was a beautiful woman, but she had very expensive, very specific tastes. She liked designer bags, luxury cars, and the idea of being a wealthy suburban wife. Derek, desperate to impress her and keep her around, proposed to her with a ring I am entirely sure my parents paid for. With an engagement came the demand for a perfect life. And Derek, who still worked a mediocre mid-level job and blew his paycheck on stupid toys, could not afford the lifestyle Morgan expected. He certainly couldn't afford a $500,000 home in a trendy neighborhood. The passive aggression began at Thanksgiving dinner last year. We were all sitting around the table at my parents' house. Morgan was talking loudly about how stressed they were looking at the housing market. My mother sighed dramatically, looking directly at me. It's just such a shame. Here is Derek, trying to start a family, trying to do the right thing, and he can't even afford a starter home. And then we have Claire. A single woman rattling around in a 3-bedroom house all by herself. It just doesn't make any logical sense. Why does a single woman need 3 bedrooms, Claire? It's almost greedy, don't you think? I kept eating my turkey, staring blankly at my plate. I use one as an office and one as a guest room, Mom. And I need them because I bought them. Derek scoffed from across the table. Yeah, but it's basically a family asset. Mom and Dad always said family helps family. You could easily sell it, give me a chunk for a down payment on a place for Morgan and me, and buy yourself a nice little condo. It's the right thing to do. I looked at him, completely stunned by the audacity. It is not a family asset, Derek. My name is on the deed. My money pays the mortgage. Family helps family? Where was the family when I was fixing the plumbing at 2 in the morning? The table went dead silent. My father slammed his fork down. We will not have this disrespect at the dinner table, Claire. Your brother is making a reasonable point. We will discuss this later. I thought it was just their usual boundary stomping talk. I didn't realize they were already formulating a plan to take what was mine. The situation escalated from passive-aggressive comments at family dinners to absolute lunacy on a random Tuesday afternoon. I had taken a half day off work because I had a massive migraine. All I wanted to do was go home, take some medication, and sleep in my quiet, safe house. I pulled into my driveway and immediately noticed a large, unfamiliar white pickup truck parked on the street in front of my property. I walked around to the side gate leading to my backyard. I heard voices. Male voices. Panic spiked in my chest. I grabbed a heavy metal flashlight I kept in my car for emergencies and slowly pushed the wooden gate open. Standing in the middle of my carefully cultivated lawn was Derek, holding a clipboard, pointing at my back porch. Next to him was a man in a high-visibility vest holding a long measuring tape. Yeah, so we'll tear out this entire deck, Derek was saying loudly to the contractor. Morgan wants a sunroom here. Glass walls, heated floors. We can push it out about 15 feet into the yard. It'll eat up the garden, but honestly, it's just weeds anyway. I stood there, completely frozen, trying to process what I was seeing. My brother had brought a contractor to my house, while he thought I was at work, to plan an extension for his future wife. On my house. What the hell are you doing? I yelled, my voice cracking with absolute fury. Derek jumped, spinning around. He had the nerve to look annoyed rather than caught. Jesus, Claire, warn a guy. What are you doing home so early? This is my house. I screamed, marching toward them. I turned to the contractor, who looked extremely uncomfortable. Sir, I do not know who hired you, but I own this property. Not him. I want you off my land right now before I call the police for trespassing. The contractor didn't say a word. He just reeled in his tape measure, nodded apologetically to me, and practically jogged out of the yard. Once we were alone, Derek rolled his eyes and crossed his arms. "You're being so dramatic, Claire. Relax. I'm just getting some estimates. Mom and Dad said we need to start moving quickly if we want the renovations done before the wedding." "Estimates for what, Derek? You do not own this house. You will never own this house." He stepped closer to me, trying to use his height to intimidate me, a classic move he learned from our father. "Look, let's stop playing games. Mom and Dad already talked to a lawyer. They said because they supported you growing up and because family assets are complicated, you owe us this. They told me to just start planning because you'll cave eventually. You always cave, Claire. So stop throwing a tantrum and let me handle the upgrades. Morgan is very particular." I was shaking so hard I could barely speak. It wasn't just entitlement anymore. It was an invasion. They truly believed I was just a placeholder, a temporary caretaker for property that rightfully belonged to the golden boy. "Get out," I whispered, pointing a trembling finger toward the street. "Get off my property. Do not ever come back here without an invitation. And you can tell Harrison and Diana that if they want this house, they will have to pry the deed out of my cold, dead hands." Derek scoffed, turned around, and walked away. "You're going to regret this, you selfish brat," he muttered as he passed me. That was the incident that pushed me to find Valerie Thorne. But before the legal war officially began, there was a party. A party where Derek's arrogant mouth finally wrote a check his reality couldn't cash. 3 weeks after the backyard incident, I was forced to attend Derek and Morgan's official engagement party. I didn't want to go, but my mother had bombarded me with hundreds of texts, threatening to show up at my office and make a scene if I embarrassed the family by not attending. To keep the peace temporarily while Valerie researched my property rights, I put on a dress, plastered a fake smile on my face, and drove to the upscale country club they had rented out. The party was exactly what you would expect. It was flashy, loud, and entirely funded by my parents. Morgan was walking around showing off a diamond ring that caught the light from every angle. Derek was holding court by the bar, acting like he was a self-made millionaire instead of a mid-level manager living on his parents' credit cards. I stayed in the corner, nursing a single glass of sparkling water, counting down the minutes until it was socially acceptable to leave. About 2 hours into the night, it was time for the toasts. Derek was already heavily intoxicated. His face was flushed, and he was slurring his words slightly as he tapped his glass with a fork. He gave a rambling, boastful speech about how much he loved Morgan and how successful their future was going to be. Then he scanned the room, his eyes landing on me in the back corner. A nasty, cruel smile spread across his face. He leaned heavily into the microphone. "And I just want to say," Derek projected his voice over the speakers, "how grateful I am that I know how to handle money. Unlike some people in this family." He winked in my direction. Several aunts and uncles chuckled. "I mean, Morgan and I are building an empire. We're investing my trust fund smartly. Not blowing it on some rotting shack in the slums and playing construction worker like my sister did." The room went quiet. A few people looked at me with pity. Others looked away, embarrassed. But I didn't feel embarrassed. I felt like the floor had just dropped out from underneath me. All the air left my lungs. "My trust fund?" I set my glass down on a nearby table because my hands had suddenly gone completely numb. I stared at Derek, who was laughing and raising his glass to his friends. 9 years ago, when I turned 25, my parents had sat me down in their living room. With solemn, disappointed faces, they told me that my grandmother Evelyn, my father's mother, the only person in the family who had ever truly shown me warmth, had changed her will right before she died. They told me she was so disappointed in my choice of major in college and my refusal to move back home that she had completely disinherited me. They said she left everything to Derek. I had cried for a week. Not because of the money, but because I believed the only person who loved me had hated me in the end. I pushed through the crowd, my vision tunneling. I walked straight up to Derek as he stepped down from the little stage. I grabbed his arm, my nails digging into his expensive suit jacket. "What did you just say?" I hissed, keeping my voice low but shaking with intensity. Derek pulled his arm away, looking at me like I was a bug. Jesus, Claire, take a joke. Don't be so sensitive. You said your trust fund, I pressed, my heart hammering a sickening beat in my ears. You said I blew mine on my house. What trust fund, Derek? He rolled his eyes and laughed right in my face. The same one you got, stupid. Grandma Evelyn's trust. $200,000 each when we turned 25. Mom and Dad said you blew yours on that dump of a house you bought. Guess that's why you're so bitter about selling it now. You made a bad investment. I couldn't breathe. The room was spinning. Derek thought I had received my money. He thought I used it to buy the house. But I hadn't. I had bought the house with my own meager savings from years of working. I had never seen a single penny of Grandmother Evelyn's money. I had never even seen the legal paperwork. My parents had been the trustees. I turned around and practically ran out of the country club. I made it to my car, locked the doors, and completely broke down. I sobbed until my throat was raw. It was a terrifying, earth-shattering realization. My parents hadn't just favored my brother. They hadn't just emotionally abused me. If what Derek said was true, my parents had systematically, legally robbed me. And now, they were trying to steal the only thing I had ever built for myself to cover their tracks. I wiped my face, the tears turning into ice-cold determination. I pulled out my phone and searched for the name of a private investigator. The time for being the ghost was over. Thank you for watching the story so far. If you are enjoying it, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below with the name of the city you are watching from. Every single comment helps the video reach more people. Thank you so much for your support. I do not remember driving home from the country club. I just remember the blinding red of the taillights in front of me and the deafening roar of my own pulse in my ears. As soon as I unlocked my front door, I did not bother taking off my coat or my heels. I went straight to the hall closet and started pulling down boxes. I kept a plastic storage bin on the top shelf that held all my old tax documents, college financial aid forms, and random paperwork I was too afraid to throw away. I dragged it into the middle of the living room floor, ripped the lid off, and started dumping folders onto the rug. My hands were shaking violently. My mind was racing, trying to piece together a puzzle where I only had half the pieces. Derek said I got a trust fund. My parents said I was disinherited. Who was lying? Derek was an arrogant jerk, but he wasn't smart enough to invent a complex lie about a trust fund while blackout drunk. He genuinely believed I had received the same $200,000 he had. I dug through years of returns. Everything from the last 5 years looked normal. I filed my own taxes, paid my own bills. But then I dug deeper, reaching the very bottom of the bin, where the paperwork from my early 20s was shoved into an unlabeled manila envelope. I pulled out a stack of papers from 9 years ago, the year I turned 25. I sifted through them until my fingers stopped on a strange, faded tax document. It was a Schedule K-1 form. I barely knew what it meant back then, and I hardly knew now, but I could read the bold letters at the top. It listed an LLC, a limited liability company, named Claire Hartley Holdings. I stared at the paper until the words blurred. I had never opened an LLC. I had never owned a business. But there, right on the signature line, was my name. It wasn't my handwriting. The loop on the letter C was too rounded. The cross on the letter T was too sharp. It looked exactly like my mother's handwriting when she was trying to write quickly. I closed my eyes as a memory from that year suddenly slammed into me. I was fresh out of college, exhausted, working a double shift at a restaurant. My mother had stopped by my apartment with a stack of papers, telling me it was just some routine insurance stuff to keep me on their health plan for a few more months. She had pointed to the lines, told me to sign, and I did, because I was too tired to read them and because, despite everything, I still foolishly trusted my mother not to forge legal documents. They had created a fake company in my name. They had stolen my identity to hide the money. The gaslighting was so profound, so absolute, that I felt physically sick. They had spent 9 years making me feel like a worthless disappointment who had been rejected by her own grandmother, all while stealing my inheritance to fund Derek's life. I sat alone on the floor of my house, surrounded by paper, and wept for the 25-year-old girl who had believed she was unlovable. The next morning, I called out sick from work. I opened my laptop, searched for private investigators in my area with backgrounds in financial fraud, and found a man named Elliot Cho. I called his office, explained the situation through tears, and booked a consultation for that afternoon. When I met Elliot, he was a quiet, unassuming man in his 50s who took meticulous notes and asked sharp, pointed questions. I handed him the strange tax document, told him about the trust fund Derek mentioned, and gave him the names and addresses of my parents and brother. Elliot told me it would take a few weeks to trace the money, especially if they had used shell companies. Those few weeks were the hardest of my life. My parents, entirely unaware that I had discovered their secret, continued their campaign of harassment. My mother sent me listings for small, depressing apartments, telling me I would be much happier in a smaller space. My father left voicemails reminding me that Friday was the deadline to sign the house over to Derek before they filed their lawsuit. I ignored all of it. Instead, I spent my evenings sitting in my garden, thinking about grandmother Evelyn. Evelyn was the complete opposite of her son, my father. She was warm, fiercely intelligent, and saw right through my parents' toxic favoritism. I remembered spending summers at her house, baking bread in her kitchen. She used to brush my hair and tell me that my independence was a superpower, not a flaw. She told me that while Derek needed constant applause to survive, I had a quiet strength that would build an empire. When my parents told me she had disinherited me, it broke something fundamental inside me. I thought my independence had finally alienated the only person who cared. Knowing now that it was a lie, knowing that Evelyn had loved me enough to leave me a massive head start in life, was a strange mixture of profound grief and intense comfort. She hadn't abandoned me. They had just built a wall of lies to hide her love. I held on to that thought like a lifeline as I waited for Elliot's phone call. 3 weeks later, I was back in Valerie Thorne's upscale office. Elliot Cho sat next to me, placing a thick, heavy black binder on the mahogany desk. Valerie opened it, her eyes scanning the first page. Even her usually cold, professional demeanor cracked for a second. She let out a long, low whistle. "Claire," Valerie said softly, looking up at me. "Your parents are not just bad parents. They are career criminals." Elliot leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. It took some digging, but the trail is surprisingly sloppy. Here is exactly what happened. Your grandmother Evelyn left a trust fund of $400,000 to be split equally between you and Derek when you each turned 25. Your parents were named as the trustees, meaning they managed the accounts until you hit the required age. Elliot flipped the page, pointing to copies of bank statements. When you turned 25, the $200,000 was legally supposed to be transferred to your personal accounts. Instead, your parents used your forged signature to open Claire Hartley Holdings LLC. They transferred your $200,000 into that business account. Over the next 9 years, they systematically drained it. My stomach churned. Where did the money go? Everywhere, Elliot replied flatly. They used it to pay off the mortgage on their own house. They bought Derek his luxury cars. They paid off Derek's credit card debt. And recently, they withdrew $30,000 in cash, which I strongly suspect paid for Morgan's diamond engagement ring. Valerie flipped to the back of the binder. But that is not even the worst part, Claire. Because this LLC was registered under your Social Security number, the tax liability for the phantom income they moved around falls entirely on you. If the Internal Revenue Service had audited this company, you would have been personally on the hook for tens of thousands of dollars in back taxes and penalties for money you never even saw. They didn't just rob you. They left a ticking time bomb attached to your name. The silence in the office was deafening. The last remnants of the scared little girl inside me evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. They had stolen my grandmother's gift. They had funded my brother's arrogant lifestyle with my money. And now, because that money was finally gone, they were trying to steal the house I had built with my own bleeding hands to keep the charade going. I didn't cry. The grief was gone, burned away by a raging, white-hot fury. I looked at Valerie. They said they're going to sue me for my house on Friday. What do we do? Valerie smiled, and this time, it was a smile of pure, predatory anticipation. We let them file their frivolous, ridiculous little lawsuit. Let them put everything on the public record. Because the minute they do, we are going to file a countersuit that will hit them so hard they won't know which way is up. My parents made good on their threat. But they didn't just file the lawsuit, they made sure the delivery was as humiliating as possible. I was at work, sitting in a glass-walled conference room leading a presentation for my logistics team. Suddenly, the receptionist knocked nervously on the door and said someone was here to see me. Before I could answer, a man in a cheap suit pushed past her, walked right into the conference room, and slammed a thick stack of legal papers onto the table in front of my colleagues. "Claire Hartley? You've been served," he announced loudly, making sure everyone in the room heard him. I felt the blood drain from my face as my coworkers stared in shocked silence. I calmly picked up the papers, excused myself, and walked to my office. The lawsuit was exactly what they promised. They were claiming that I had made a verbal contract to hold the property for Derek, that I was committing fraud by refusing to transfer the deed, and they were seeking immediate repossession of the home. It was a complete legal fiction, but it was designed to terrify me. Within an hour of the papers being served, my phone started vibrating off my desk. My parents had clearly coordinated an attack. The extended family group chat, which had over 40 aunts, uncles, and cousins in it, exploded. My Aunt Linda wrote, "I cannot believe you are doing this to your own parents, Claire. They are devastated. Give your brother the house." My Uncle Ray added, "You have always been a selfish brat. Dragging the family into court because you want to live in a mansion alone? Disgusting." Even cousins I hadn't spoken to in years chimed in, calling me a monster, a gold digger, and a terrible sister. They were trying to isolate me. They were trying to apply so much social pressure that I would break down, withdraw, and sign the papers just to make the screaming stop. That was how it always worked when I was a kid. But I wasn't a kid anymore. I looked at my phone, reading the barrage of hateful messages from people who had never once asked how I was doing when I was freezing in an empty house. I took a deep breath, typed out a single, cryptic response, and hit send. If you are also concerned about legal matters and family loyalty, I suggest you check the county court's public filings next Friday. Until then, do not contact me. Then I permanently blocked every single number in the group chat, turned my phone on silent, and drove to Valerie's office. It was time to unleash hell. Valerie had been busy. When I arrived, she had an entire war room set up. Whiteboards covered in timelines, financial flowcharts, and legal statutes. "They filed," I said, dropping their ridiculous lawsuit onto her desk. Valerie barely glanced at it. "Garbage. It will be dismissed by a judge in 5 minutes. But it opens the door for us to file our response. Are you ready to see what a real lawsuit looks like, Claire?" She handed me a bound document. Our countersuit. I read through the charges, and a profound sense of empowerment washed over me. We weren't just defending my ownership of the house. We were going on the offensive. Valerie had drafted charges for grand larceny, criminal fraud, and identity theft. We were suing my parents for the original $200,000, plus 9 years of compounding interest, plus punitive damages for emotional distress and legal fees. I am also sending a duplicate of this financial binder directly to the Internal Revenue Service, Valerie said, her voice completely detached and professional. Tax fraud is a federal offense. The IRS does not play games with fake LLCs used to hide income. Your parents are going to owe massive penalties, and there is a very real chance of federal prison time. I looked down at the papers. For a brief, fleeting second, the conditioning of my childhood flared up. Am I really going to do this? Am I really going to destroy my parents' lives? But then I remembered Derek standing in my backyard, measuring my garden to tear it down. I remembered my mother calling my house a rotten coffin. I remembered the forged signature, the stolen money, and the absolute cruelty of making me believe my grandmother hated me. They had destroyed my life first. I was just handing them the receipt. Valerie handed me a thick black pen. Sign on the last page, Claire. Once you sign this, there is no going back. It becomes public record. It becomes a war. I took the pen. My hand wasn't shaking anymore. I signed my name in bold, sharp letters. As the ink dried, I felt a physical weight lift off my shoulders. I was shedding the victimhood they had draped over me. I was finally fighting back. They scheduled a family intervention dinner for tomorrow night, I told Valerie. My mother commanded me to be there to discuss their lawsuit. They want an audience to watch me surrender. Valerie's eyes lit up. Oh, that is perfect. Elliot and I will accompany you as your legal and investigative counsel. I wouldn't miss this dinner for the world. The following evening, I pulled up to my parents' large, pristine suburban home. The driveway was packed with cars. My mother had invited the entire extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins, everyone who had been trashing my name in the group chat. It was an ambush. I walked through the front door, flanked by Valerie in her sharp navy suit and Elliot holding his heavy black briefcase. The murmur of conversation in the dining room instantly died. I walked into the room. My parents sat at the head of the massive dining table, looking like martyred saints. Derek sat to their right, holding Morgan's hand, looking incredibly smug. The rest of the family surrounded them, staring at me with open hostility. You brought lawyers? My father, Harrison, scoffed, his face turning red. This is a family matter, Claire. Tell your hired help to wait outside. They stay, I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent room. I didn't sit down. I stood at the opposite end of the table, looking directly at my parents. You wanted an intervention. Here I am. Speak. My mother squeezed out a few fake tears. Claire, honey, look what you are doing to us. Look at this family. We just want peace. We just want you to do the right thing and help your brother. The lawsuit was just to make you realize how serious this is. We will drop it the second you sign the deed over. Please, stop being so stubborn. I'm not a deadbeat, Claire, Derek chimed in, playing his role perfectly. I need that house to start my life. You have no idea how stressful it is to plan a future when the economy is this bad. You just got lucky with that house. You owe the family some of that luck. I let him finish. I let the silence hang in the air for a long, painful 10 seconds. I looked at every single aunt and uncle who had called me a monster. Then I turned to Elliot. Elliot unclasped his briefcase. He pulled out 20 copies of a heavily redacted summary of the financial crimes. He began walking around the table, calmly placing a packet in front of every single family member. What is this? Uncle Ray demanded, looking at the papers. That, I said, my voice ringing like a bell, is the truth. You want to talk about family assets, Derek? Let's talk about the $200,000 trust fund grandmother Evelyn left me. The one our parents stole. The room erupted in confused murmurs. My father stood up, his chair scraping violently against the wood floor. Shut up. You don't know what you are talking about. Get out of my house. Sit down, Harrison. Valerie commanded, her voice cracking like a whip. It was so authoritative that my father actually flinched and sat back down. I kept my eyes locked on Derek. You thought I blew my trust fund on my house, didn't you? Because that's what they told you. But they lied to you, Derek. They forged my signature. They created a fake company. They stole my money, and they used it to pay for your college dropouts, your cars, and that diamond ring on Morgan's finger. Morgan gasped, pulling her hand away from Derek's as if he had burned her. They spent all my money, I continued, my voice rising in volume and power. And because you are completely broke, Derek, they panicked. They realized they had nothing left to give you. So they decided to sue me for a house I bought with my own blood and sweat, hoping they could steal from me a second time to keep their golden boy happy. Lies, my mother shrieked, her face pale with absolute terror. She is making it up. It has already been filed with the court, Diana, Valerie said coldly, along with a criminal referral to the Internal Revenue Service for tax fraud and identity theft. The evidence is bulletproof. I looked at my parents, really looked at them, and saw nothing but pathetic, terrified strangers. You have 48 hours, I said, the finality of my words settling heavily over the room. You have 48 hours to drop your lawsuit against my house and to wire the stolen $200,000 plus interest into my attorney's escrow account. If the money is not there by Friday at noon, we proceed with criminal charges. You will both go to federal prison." I didn't wait for an answer. I turned around and walked out the front door, leaving the empire of lies to burn behind me. The explosion inside that dining room was something I only heard about later, mostly from the frantic voicemails left by the very aunts and uncles who had cursed my name hours before. Once the family actually read the documents Elliot provided, the tide turned violently. Family loyalty only goes so far when massive federal tax fraud is involved. The relatives who had supported my parents suddenly realized they were defending criminals. Uncle Ray, who had called me disgusting, ended up screaming at my father for being a thief. But the biggest casualty of the night was Derek's future. Morgan was a lot of things, but she wasn't an idiot. When she realized Derek wasn't a wealthy investor with a trust fund, but a broke man living off stolen money, she took off the engagement ring, left it on the dining room table, and walked out of the house. She broke off the engagement that exact night. Derek's entire fabricated life collapsed in front of an audience of 40 people. The next 48 hours were a blur of pathetic desperation. My phone rang constantly with blocked numbers. My parents hired a cheap defense attorney who called Valerie, trying to negotiate a settlement, trying to beg for mercy, asking if I would accept a payment plan. Valerie was a shark who smelled blood in the water. She rejected every offer. Full payment, plus interest, or the criminal referral moves forward to the district attorney, she repeated like a broken record. Of course, they didn't have the money. They had spent my entire inheritance funding their lifestyle and spoiling Derek. To avoid going to prison for grand larceny, my parents had to completely liquidate their assets. They had to drain their retirement accounts. And, in the ultimate stroke of poetic justice, they had to list their beautiful suburban home for sale at a massive loss just to generate the cash to pay me back. By Friday at 11:55 in the morning, the money hit Valerie's escrow account. They dropped their frivolous lawsuit against my house. In return, I signed a legally binding non-disclosure agreement stating I would not pursue state criminal charges for the theft. However, I did not stop the IRS investigation. I couldn't, even if I wanted to. Once the federal government knows about a fake LLC and unpaid taxes, they do not let go. The IRS audited my parents, hitting them with catastrophic penalties for 9 years of fraudulent filings. Within 2 months, my parents were entirely bankrupt. They moved into a cramped, 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. Derek, utterly disgraced and without his fiancée, had to move into that tiny apartment with them. The golden child and the martyr parents, finally trapped together in a prison of their own making. 6 months after the dinner, I was sitting on my back porch. It was a beautiful spring morning. The garden was blooming, the neighborhood was quiet, and my house felt lighter, as if the dark energy of my parents' expectations had finally been scrubbed from the brickwork. A delivery driver walked up my driveway and handed me a certified envelope. The return address belonged to an estate law firm I didn't recognize. I opened it carefully. Inside was a letter from an attorney stating that he was the executor of my grandmother Evelyn's estate. He explained that he had seen my name pop up in the public court records regarding the lawsuit and realized he finally needed to contact me. Enclosed in the envelope was a small leather journal and a cashier's check made out to me for $50,000. My hands shook as I opened the journal. It was Evelyn's handwriting. The last entry was dated just weeks before she died. My dearest Claire, the entry read. If you are reading this, it means you have finally broken free. I always feared your father and mother would try to keep your inheritance from you. They resent your strength because it highlights their weakness. I left the main trust in their care because the law required it, but I secretly set aside this small account just for you, hidden where they could never find it. I know they make you feel small, Claire, but I see you. The life you will build with your own 2 hands will be worth far more than any money I could ever leave you. Take this final gift, build your beautiful life, and do not let their darkness cast a shadow on your light. I am so incredibly proud of the woman you are. Tears streamed down my face, but they were not tears of grief. They were tears of absolute, overwhelming closure. Evelyn had known. She had seen my struggle, and she had reached out from beyond the grave to give me the final piece of validation I had spent my entire life searching for. I didn't put the $50,000 into savings. I used it to hire a contractor to build a massive, beautiful, heated glass greenhouse right in the middle of my backyard, in the exact spot where Derek had tried to build his extension. Today, my house is entirely mine. Free and clear of debt, free and clear of toxic family ties. I don't speak to my parents. I block any email Derek tries to send. I built new, healthy relationships with the few cousins who apologized to me. My parents thought the threat of the law would make me crumble. Instead, the law became my sword. I didn't just keep my house. I brought their house of lies crashing down around them. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't just living well. It is living honestly, with nothing left to hide and nothing left to fear. They say blood is thicker than water, but in my case, the water I used to mix the cement for my foundation was much stronger than any blood ties. Looking back at how I destroyed their lives to protect my own, a small, lingering part of me sometimes wonders, am I wrong for not giving them a second chance? Thank you for watching until the very end. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider hitting that button and turning on notifications so you never miss another story. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one of them. See you in the next video.